In this lesson, we'll be covering the print and cut application and process using Graphtec Studio. This is the process of preparing a design to print and then cutting the print on a cutter by following a path that contours around the image. This process can be used for making decals, packaging designs, and other applications. The steps for this process begin by first creating the design, then create a cut path around the design. This will be the cut path that the cutter will follow when the print is cut. Apply registration marks to the design. Registration marks are L-shaped marks that are on the four corners just outside the image design and cut path. They are printed with the design and are like a mapping system that is used by the cutter so that it will know where to cut. The next steps of the process will first send the design to the printer, and then after the print is completed, load the print into the cutter and then send the cut path. It is recommended that you review any documentation or video instructions that are available for your cutter on the print and cut process. After the design is completed, a cut path around the design needs to be created. The offset function can be used for this. Select the complete design around which you'll create the cut path. Click on the Offset tool icon. This will open the Offset side panel. Let's set the offset to 1/4 inch and then click Apply. Once the cut path outline is created, click on the Line Styles tool icon and increase the thickness of the line. This will make it easier to see. We can also apply a dashed line to it to distinguish it from the other graphics. Notice that dashed lines do not have any bearing on how they will be cut. In other words, the cut path will not make the cutter cut a dashed line. It is truly for looks. Next, we have to give the cut path a unique color that is not used elsewhere in the design. This will become apparent when cutting the cut path. Let's choose this light gray. Once the cut path has been created, the next step is to set the registration marks. As mentioned, registration marks are printed with the design and are like a mapping system that is used by the cutter so that it will know where to cut. Graphtec Studio provides a special feature for automatically creating registration marks. It provides several types of registration mark patterns that can be used for different purposes. To access the registration mark settings, click on the Registration Mark tool icon. The first choice is to choose the style. Currently, the registration marks are turned off or disabled. To enable them, click on the Style pull-down list. The registration marks are categorized by type, the number of registration marks, and patterns. You'll see that all registration marks are either Type 1 or Type 2. The difference is that Type 1 registration marks are shaped like an L bracket with their corners pointing inward. Type 2, on the other hand, have their corners pointing outward. Type 2 are the most commonly used registration marks since they provide a little more space for your design. The first two choices are with 4 marks. Clicking on one of the first two choices will place one registration mark on each of the 4 corners of the design. The next 4 choices use segmented registration marks. This type of pattern is used when cutting long prints. Besides the 4 corner registration marks are also placed in between the corner registration marks. The cutter uses these intermediary marks to determine if any bowing has occurred during the printing process. In a print like this, if only the 4 corners were scanned, you might find that the beginning and the end of the printed image are cut accurately, but the midsection would be a little off. On the other hand, when reading these registration marks, the cutter can adjust the cut line to compensate for the shifting that may have occurred during the print process. The last 4 choices of registration marks limit the number of registration marks. These patterns are mostly used on smaller jobs where 4 registration marks may not be necessary. Keep in mind though that when choosing a pattern, whether corner or segmented, the more registration marks, the better the accuracy. In this case, we'll choose 4 marks type 2. It places the 4 registration marks on the 4 corners. If we were to choose segmented registration marks, we would be able to determine the distance between them by the step size value here. The next section, Dimensions, has 2 settings that determine the length and thickness of the registration marks. If you plan to cut a long printed design, it is recommended that you set the length to their highest value, since this will ensure that the registration marks will be captured during the scanning process. If you plan to use laminate, then make the registration marks thick, since this allows the cutter registration mark sensor to capture the marks more readily. The last 4 settings set the margins between the design and the registration marks. As these values are adjusted, the changes are seen in real time in the preview area. Relative to has 2 choices. Job sets the registration marks away from the job design based upon the 4 settings below, whereas Media will place the registration marks relative to the media's edge based upon the 4 settings below. So far, we have created a cut path and have placed the registration marks. The next step is to print and then cut the design. To print the design, the cut path first has to be turned off or disabled for printing. To do this, click on the Configure Cut Job tool icon. And under Apply Conditions, click on By Color. We need to disable the color for our cut path. Now we simply click on the File pull-down menu and select Print. When using a RIP, generally a built-in driver is provided to send the job to the RIP. Once the job is printed, the next step is to cut the job. At this point, you'll want to unload the print from the printer and load it into the cutter. To make sure it is oriented properly in the cutter, locate on the print where the front edge is. When the preview area is in cutting mode, it will have a little cutter icon label in the upper left-hand corner of the preview area. This will indicate the direction the printed design is to come out. In this case, the front edge is at the bottom end of the preview area. Let's turn the cut path back on by clicking again on the Configure Cut Job tool icon. Then click on By Color under the Apply Conditions heading if it is not selected, and turn the cut path back on. At the same time, the rest of the design colors must be turned off so that they don't cut. Now we can click on the Cutter pull-down menu, hover the mouse over Send Cut Job, and select the cutter we would like to use. If we click on the Cutter tool icon, we can observe that it is registering, which indicates that it is scanning for the marks.